Hi, I'm Kimbu, the host of the Author Alchemist podcast. I bring my years of experience as a fan fiction writer, a professionally published author, and a productivity coach to the problem we all love to hate, the act of writing. I also talk a lot about self publishing, marketing, and my own challenges and journey as an author. Maybe you can relate? Hey y'all, it's Kimbu, and I am back with another episode of the Author Alchemist podcast. This is episode 46. Wow. And I'm actually recording this on November, what is it? Oh, looking at my computer. November 12th, 2023. My, how time flies. And time flies for me, particularly, this person here, because I spent almost a whole week at a writer's retreat. If you just got back earlier this week. And y'all, it was amazing. It was hosted by my good friend, professional editor and historical fiction author, Gina Hogan Edwards. She does these twice a year. They're women only. Sorry, dudes. But it was wonderful. It's hosted right on the Florida Gulf Coast. And while it was a little bit cooler than what I'm used to, like nobody went swimming, uh, it was the weather was otherwise very cooperative. It was absolutely gorgeous. So many gorgeous sunrises and sunset. Our house is right on the beach, and my bedroom had open windows, so I could hear the surf right outside the window, rock me to sleep like a baby, and it was just a magical time. And then we return to the real world. My dog missed me, but also she needs some work done on her teeth, and I really should do some laundry. And there's dishes in the sink. So back to the real life, away from the writer's life. And actually that's what I wanted to talk about with this episode was the idea of the writer's life. Because I think in our society, culture, modern world, whatever you want to call it, there's a real entrenched idea that a writer's life is all about the writing and that a writer is only a writer if they're a full-time writer or if they've written so many books or if they like there's all this gatekeeping for it. But at the retreat, I was there. I was working on my memoir, The Empty Bowl. I wasn't working on any of my fiction, although I have enough fiction to work on. Could have done that. There was a couple other writers who were specifically working on fiction, but we also had a couple of poets. We had a multimedia artist. We had people who had been working on their story or their memoir for a long time, but hadn't really written much to it. Jotted down ideas, done some research, that type of thing. There was such a cross section of people I would call writers. And the writer's life was, for that week, focused not necessarily on writing. And I think that's the thing that trips a lot of people up. A writer's life is about creativity. It's about tapping into that wellspring of storytelling that I think is just so intrinsic to the human mind. Like you might argue that language itself was developed to tell stories about the world around us. At least I'm going to make that argument. I don't know if anybody else has. Been a long time since I studied linguistics. And I wanted to bring that back to the quote unquote real life with a renewed sense of purpose of committing to my creativity. A lot of writers, and this isn't just newbie writers, people who haven't written a lot, writers with years and years of experience, we tend to cling to ideas like perfectionism. We suffer from imposter syndrome. And those of us, especially in the professional world of writing and publishing, tend to do a lot of comparisonitis, as my friend Gina calls it. where you compare yourself to somebody else who might be doing something similar to what you want to do, and either they've done it or they've done it and they've been successful at it, or whatever your metric is, to compare yourself to other people. But that is all just window dressing. It is all part of how we deal with our own insecurities. And I'm not saying none of that is valid, because these are real things. I know with a lot of my writing clients, I do productivity coaching for writers, that these can be major stumbling blocks. So I wanted to look at the writer's life from the perspective of something a bit more holistic than you've written a story and you're going to get it published or whatever you're going to do with it. I don't care. Like any commitment you make to get better at something, you will get better and find more value in writing the more that you do it. And this is hard for a lot of us, because we write a story, or we write a couple of stories, or we write a novel, and we just want to polish it until it shines and make it perfect. I certainly get that, and I certainly have stories I've done that with myself. But I think if you really want to have the confidence that can come from not just writing a story and saying, I wrote this, ta-da, but being able to confidently and, I guess the word I'm not looking at, securely, no, that's not the word I'm looking for, fulfillingly, I guess is the word I'm looking for here. If you want to feel fulfilled by your creative urges, then you've got to satisfy those creative urges by writing. Sorry, that's the bad news for the day. You're going to have to do it by writing. I am often reminded of the old, I don't want to call it urban legend necessarily. There was a whole book about it. It's been debunked, it's been rebunked, it's been argued about a long time, but it's the idea that to master something, to become truly good at it, you have to put in 10,000 hours worth of work. Now, how accurate is that? I don't know. I'm not delving into the psychology of it, but I think it's a pretty good rule of thumb. You want to get better at drawing, you need to draw for 10,000 hours. You want to get better at ice skating, well, you better ice skate for 10,000 hours. It's not a bad goal, is what I'm saying here, right? And with writing, it's similar, but it becomes tricky because a lot of people get into this and think that, editing is part of that 10,000 hours, and world building and research are part of those 10,000 hours. Rewriting a story is part of that 10,000 hours. And I think the argument can be made that they are, but also, are they really? Like, I often come back to the analogy of a fine arts painter who's learning oil painting in order to paint like the masters, right? And they can study as many books as they want, and they can do a big painting and try to make it as perfect as they want. They're not going to really master the techniques and internalize them to the point where their eye-hand coordination is so good that they can just riff on it and come up with something fairly close to what they want. They have to actually paint. They actually have to work with the materials and do dozens and dozens and hundreds of paintings over the course of their lives to hit the goal that they're aiming for. And that is true for writers as well. So the rule of thumb that I've come up with is 1 million words. Most people I know who've written 1 million words or more tend to have a very solid grasp of their author voice, their personal style, the types of characters they like to write about, the themes they like to explore, the tropes that they love, the tropes that they hate. They're very secure in what they can do. And so whether they do suffer from imposter syndrome or not, or perfectionism, they still have a very good idea up in here of what their skill set is and what they need to work on, what they've got down pretty well. If they don't like what they're doing, they know how to take it in a different direction because they have a very solid understanding of how they got there in the first place. So when I talk about the writing life, I'm talking about people who are investing themselves creatively in their writing and aiming for that 1 million words goal. And I'm not saying that you're not a real writer unless you've written a million words, that you can't submit stories to um, markets or publications or an agent unless you've written a million words, that you're, not serious if you haven't written a word. That's not at all what I'm saying. I'm saying that that is a good rule of thumb goal to aim for in order to achieve what you want creatively. I think it's also a good goal because it forces you to write over and over and over again, and there's no better way to build your confidence and to find your groove as a creator, as a storyteller, than simply just putting the words out there on the page, on the screen, however you write. Doesn't matter to me. Again, I'm like, it's, oh, you're only a real writer if you write every day. Like, well, yeah, the real writer does write every day, but also I know a lot of writers who write like twice a week. Um, Especially one of them has ADHD, and so she actually like doesn't necessarily plan her writing sprints, but she does know that at some point during the week she's going to sit down for like 6 hours straight, go down a hyper focus rabbit hole and get all of her writing done and write like, 7,000 words. Sounds like a nightmare to me, but that's the way her brain works. Writing every day actually throws her off more than helps her. So it's understanding how you write as well. You're not going to know it unless, wait for it, unless you start writing. That's what you have to do. You have to start writing. So it didn't matter that my writers' retreat had many different kinds of writers, like, oh, only a fiction writer, only a science fiction writer retreat. I'm not disparaging specific genre style retreats or workshops or clinics or whatever, because they serve their purpose too. They have a valid reason to exist. There are important aspects of different genres that people need to become familiar with, and they can become familiar with it through reading, and they can become familiar with it through studying, and they can become familiar with it through going to workshops and classes. But in addition to that, you need to be writing a lot of words. And that's what those women were there to do. Whether it was poetry, whether it was multimedia type of art and spoken word and written word performance, or just a plain old-fashioned young adult novel, they were there to put in the words. They were there to put in the time because they felt the call to tell the story. And if you feel that call, the best way to tell the story is to write the words. Just sit down and do it. The benefit of aiming for 1 million words of writing is that you will learn so much by doing. Like, yes, you can take one of your stories and review it and review it and review it and fix it. And that's what editors are for. And that's what all those how to write a novel guides are for. And all of them have some use and tools in it. But you're not going to really create, I should say. You're not really going to create your own writing style unless you're writing. You're not really going to understand sentence style, sentence structure, paragraph structure until you've written a lot. For me, I used a cheat code, and it was called fan fiction. At the time I got back into fan fiction, I had been a fan as a young girl, but I fell out of it. And long story there, won't bore you, but I came back into it around late 2007, right before the big emotional breakdown of 2008. And it carried me through that and through my divorce as well, because what it gave me was permission to write. Back to this idea that a lot of writers have, that writing only counts if it's published, that writing only counts if you've got an agent or whatever. You would put some gatekeeping thing up there and just let it roll. I had suffered a lot of that over the years, and I had finally come to the conclusion that one, I didn't want to play those reindeer games, and two, I didn't think people wanted to read what I wrote. So how was I ever going to get an agent? How was I ever going to get published? Like back in the 90s, my friends, for those of you not old enough to remember, you couldn't just go publish something on the internet. Like, well, you could, but it was a blog. Like it was a very simple type of thing to do. It wasn't a book. You couldn't self-publish a book. You could, but that's a different story altogether. It was a huge time and money investment and was guaranteed to make you a laughingstock because only fools went the vanity press way. That's a little bit of history for you. But I just bowed out and I just felt, well, what was the point of writing? I mean, I was never going to get published, so why bother? And then in this dark time of my life, I fell into fan fiction again, and I started writing fan fiction just as an escape from everything bad that was going on in my life that I didn't feel like I had control over. And in some instances, I did not have control over. And I wrote, and I wrote, and I wrote myself to exhaustion sometimes. And I woke up, went and sat down and started writing. I wrote while I was working, and I had really shitty jobs. So sitting and writing fan fiction at work wasn't a problem because that was, I like working at front desk or something and nobody cared. And I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I wrote. And people read what I wrote. People gave me feedback on what I wrote. And that was helpful. But more importantly, I started seeing my own weaknesses as a writer. And the better I got at spotting that and the better I got at fixing those problems, the more confidence and inspiration I found. Because I knew I could fix those problems, because I knew there were more stories I wanted to tell. It took a few years to get to 1 million words, but I did. And honestly, if you combine all that I've written with fan fiction with all of my original fiction, probably closer to 2 million words over the course of my life at this point. But of course, I'm also old. So, gotta take that into account. And yes, part of the joy was posting it on the forums and the community groups and having people read it and leaving comments. But the fact that I could just let loose, just write what I wanted to write in a way that I wanted to write it without any guardrails or constraints or overwhelming burden of, is this fine art? Because it was fan fiction. Of course it's not fine art. Like the weight was off. Like I didn't have to prove anything to anybody. It could be as terrible a writer as I was terrible a writer at the time. But by 2010, I think I'd almost hit 1 million words by that point of fan fiction. I got my first original novel published. It was a genre novel. It was a romance novel. It was published by an indie press, not by a big name New York publisher, but it was popular. People read it, and I was proud of it. And I think that's even more important. I can look back on it now, and I do, and say, was that an info dump? That was an info dump. Like, why did you do that? I could look at maybe the structure. The pacing's not great on that one either. But I finished it, and it got published, and I love the story. What more do you need than to have your story out there being read by people? You don't even have to be published. You can write fan fiction. You can write original fiction and put it on your own blog. It doesn't matter. The writing life is about investing in yourself. Investing in your stories that you want to tell. Learning your own writing style. Learning the basics. Learning how to structure a story. What makes a good sentence. What sometimes isn't a great sentence, but a necessary one. As I was talking with another client recently who is worried that all their sentences are mundane and plebeian, I had to remind them sometimes you have to write that to move the story along. It's not a matter of how perfect every sentence is. It's a matter of, does the sentence serve the story you're writing? It might be a very boring sentence to say, she picked up her mug of tea. Thank you, Aunt Sheila, for the mug. She gifted me this years ago. And she walked into the kitchen to look out the back window. Okay, that's not much of a sentence. But then you have to set that up. You have to have a sentence like that because the next sentence is going to be about her looking out wistfully in the backyard where her young children used to play, wistfully, melancholy, remembering their lovely childhood and then whatever trauma drama you've decided to put all your characters through following after that. And like that can be a very moving scene. And it starts with a very boring sentence. But it's not boring to the reader because you're setting up an interesting character who's going on an interesting journey, psychologically, emotionally, or physically. And her going in there, you want to follow her, even though it's just that you're like, oh, why is she going into the kitchen to look out the back window? Oh, she's remembering her young children who've now moved on or something like that. And you've got to have that there. But when you've written enough, you know that. You're not waffling. Is that sentence not perfect and beautiful and precious enough? You're like, yeah, that sentence serves the story. That sentence serves the scene. That sentence serves the character. I can keep that sentence. Maybe I need to describe the mug. Like the mug that her Aunt Sheila gifted her years ago has many memories. Something like that, whatever. Obviously, I'm riffing, but the point remains that writing with a goal of writing to 1 million words. I know it sounds overwhelming, and I'm not saying you have to hit 1 million words, but writing with that goal in mind will get you to where you want to be so much faster than all the books, all the studying ever combined. You've got to know the basics. You've got to take the classes. You've got to read the textbooks. You've got to read the guidebooks. You've got to go to retreats and seminars and study great literature, or if not great literature, then study the literature of your chosen genre. If you're writing science fiction and fantasy, for instance, you've got to read science fiction and fantasy. That's just what you got to do. But none of that is going to get you anywhere if you don't write. And personally, I love the writing life. I love telling the stories, learning about my characters. I love talking with other writers about it. It's changed my life for the better. And so I invite you to make the goal of writing to 1 million words and see what happens in your writing life. Have a good day, y'all. Get lots of writing done, and I will talk to you again soon. Bye. And that's a wrap. Thanks for listening to me ramble on about writing here on the Author Alchemist podcast. I'm Kimber York, and I hope this episode has helped clear away the cobwebs from your inspiration. You can find all of my things at houseofyork.info. All one word, House of York, no spaces, .info. Have a lovely day, and we'll talk again soon.